Welcome back. Here we are, day 9, 30 days to Photoshop Mastery. We're almost 1/3 of the way there. Okay, so yesterday on day 8, we talked about adjustment layers and how powerful those adjustment layers are. I strategically left out one thing that makes them even more powerful, which is what we're going to talk about today: opacity and fill. And the reason why I wanted to leave these out is because these two things can be tricky to understand at first if you try to learn them alongside or along with your adjustment layers. Opacity is really just how transparent is the layer that you have selected. And fill might seem like the same thing, but it's slightly different. Fill actually works on calculations of blend modes, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. And it also targets specifically what's in that layer without targeting some of the layer styles, which we haven't talked about layer styles yet, nor have we talked about blend modes, but I want to talk about opacity and fill before we even get into those. So what I have here is everything that I did on yesterday's image. So we have our black and white adjustment layer, we have our curves adjustment layer, and we have the HSL and all the various things that we had there. So I want to turn this curve on. So this curve, when I was working with this, I was like, man, that's some pretty powerful stuff. It happened really quickly. And if you wanted to tone down how powerful it is, you could try manipulating the curve, but you might really like the way this looks. I really like the way it looks, but it's a little bit too powerful. So what do I do to tone it down? Well, what I do is I manipulate this slider here called opacity. And what opacity does is it talks about how opaque something is. If something is opaque, it's basically pure white. If it's less opaque, it's more transparent, like a window. A window would be something that's fully transparent or 100% opacity unless you have some dirt on it. And a door with no window would be 100% opacity. So what we do here is we kind of make a window with this. We move the opacity down, and as we move the opacity down, that curve's adjustment has less of an effect. So if we have it at 0, this curve is doing nothing. If we move this opacity up, let's say we can even type this in here to 25%, now the layer is starting to get some of that curve applied onto what's underneath it. Let's change this to 50% or 75%. But at 100%, it was a little much, right? At least I thought so. So I'm going to change this to 50%. Let's move up to the photo filter. This photo filter is at 100%. The density is at 20%. So watch what happens as we move the density up to 100% and then change the opacity to 20%. We get the same effect. Basically, what the density of this filter is right here is it's the opacity. So instead of this starting out at 100%, it's only giving you 20%. So with this at 20% density and 20% opacity, it's barely doing anything at all. But I just wanted to show you here that some of these adjustment layers kind of have their own opacity built into them already. So let's go to the HSL adjustment here. Now this I thought was a little bit strong as well. So if I didn't want to go into the red color and try to move the intensity down, how could I reduce the intensity of this HSL adjustment? Well, I click on the opacity and I just drop the opacity down. Now this slider is pretty cool in that you can either type in 50% here, you can click on this little arrow and move it back and forth, or you can click right here where over the word opacity, click and hold and move it left and right, and that will change the opacity of this layer, okay? So let's go up to the black and white adjustment. With the black and white adjustment, if we reduce the opacity here, this is where you can start to see that transparency effect happening. At 50% opacity, we're basically telling this black and white adjustment layer to let 50% of the colors through. So before, when we had this set to 100%, all the way up to 100%, we couldn't see any of those underlying colors underneath. But if we want a little bit of them to creep through, well, we just change this opacity, and as we slowly lower the opacity, some of that color can creep through. This can be a really great way of getting a nice vintage effect on your photograph, where you partially make the photo black and white, but let the colors creep through with opacity. So all this talk about opacity, you're thinking, what the heck is fill? Well, turn this layer on. By default, this layer is going to be off when we first show up here in Photoshop, if you open up this image and follow along. So turn this layer on, and you can see I've kind of made like a semi-postcard here. I already did the text here, some layer styles to this, so you wouldn't have to do that. So if we go up to this layer and we have this layer selected, make sure we have this layer selected, you're going to notice that the opacity is still at 100%. When we change the opacity, each layer gets its own opacity or own fill adjustment. Okay, that's important to note, that anytime you change the opacity here, it's not going to change the opacity of anything underneath. It's only changing the opacity of the given layer that you have selected. So let's click on this Kansas City one. So what happens if we reduce the opacity of Kansas City? the text up there of Kansas City. Well, if we reduce that opacity, the whole thing starts to become invisible. That's the layer style, or the shadow, the drop shadow that I have there, plus the stroke path of the color red for the Kansas City Chiefs, the best football team on the planet. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and increase that opacity here. The difference between opacity and fill, and this is where this becomes very evident, is right here. I'm going to zoom in on this Kansas City text, and I'm going to show you what happens as we start to drop the fill. The fill here is actually what is the given layer. So the given layer is text, and the text was written Kansas City MO for Kansas City, Missouri. As we drop that fill, the lettering starts to drop out, or the colors of the letters start to drop out. But what remains are the stroke path and the drop shadow that we had placed on this image. Pretty cool how even with just the drop shadow, you can still make out the words Kansas City. So the fill is what is available within that layer to drop out. Any layer styles that you had attached to that, like the stroke path or the drop shadow, are not going to drop out with it. Instead, they still show up, which is actually a pretty interesting thing that you can do with text in your photographs. Now, if we drop that opacity though, what happens? If we drop that to 0, we lose everything, because that's the overall intensity of the entire layer plus all of the effects that it would have attached to it. Now, I know we haven't talked about any layer styles yet. Typically in photography, you're not really going to work much with layer styles anyway. Those are typically going to be things that you're working with for text and fonts and stuff. So we're not really going to cover that too much in this 30 days. But I wanted you to see here that this fill plays a part in how that layer is calculating with the rest of the image. It's not going to be that apparent today, but tomorrow when we start to talk about blend modes, this fill adjustment layer here is actually critical for working with some of our blend modes that we have in Photoshop. So today, all I wanted you to do was to jump in here and dabble with opacity and dabble with fill. That's it. And do it on this layer that I have here so you don't have to worry about making any adjustments to the drop shadow or the stroke or anything like that. Just play with this adjustment and play with the fill to drop that down and experiment with the opacity on these different layers. And if you really want to be an overachiever, open up your own image, play with some adjustment layers, and manipulate their opacity. So bring an adjustment layer way up as high as you can. Make it look ugly and nasty and gnarly. And then reduce the opacity to see what kind of effect that has on your photo. Tomorrow, we're going to introduce another topic that each layer has in it, and that's called a blend mode. Blend modes mixed with opacity, mixed with adjustment layers, are what make Photoshop the most powerful editing tool on the planet for photographers. We're starting to build up here. We're starting to get more advanced here, and things are going to start heating up, and you're really going to start enjoying it, because this is where the potential of making phenomenal photos starts to come to fruition.